Good evening, dear viewer. Tonight, we embark on a journey that will test every assumption you hold about survival, comfort, and the simple act of existing. You're about to discover what happens when the unthinkable becomes your daily reality, when the warmth you take for granted becomes a luxury beyond imagination, and when every breath you take might be your last. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can also listen on Spotify or explore history audiobooks on Audible. Both are linked in the description for you. The year is 1847, and you are Margaret Whitmore, wife of a modest shopkeeper in the industrial town of Manchester. But this is no ordinary winter. This is the winter that will be remembered as the coldest in recorded history, when temperatures plummet so far below freezing that even seasoned meteorologists will struggle to believe their instruments. You awaken not to the gentle sound of church bells or the familiar clatter of horse-drawn carriages, but to something far more ominous. The silence is absolute, suffocating, broken only by the occasional crack of timber contracting in the merciless cold. Your first sensation is not the soft embrace of morning light filtering through curtains, but the sharp, knife-like air that seems to cut through every layer of fabric, every barrier between your skin and the frozen world beyond. The room around you is a testament to the brutal reality of 1847 domestic life. There is no central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostats to adjust with the simple turn of a dial. Instead, there is only the cold brick of the fireplace that died sometime during the night, leaving nothing but ash and the lingering memory of warmth. The walls themselves seem to radiate cold, as if the very stones have absorbed the winter's fury and now exhale it back into your living space. Your husband lies beside you, his breathing shallow and visible in small puffs of condensation that rise and dissipate in the frigid air. The woolen blankets that seemed adequate just weeks ago now feel pathetically thin, offering about as much protection as tissue paper against a hurricane. Every movement sends shockwaves of cold through the bedding, and you realize with growing horror that the water in the wash basin across the room has frozen solid. But this is only the beginning of your daily ordeal. Rising from bed requires a level of mental preparation that modern people simply cannot comprehend. Each movement must be calculated, deliberate, because exposing any part of your body to the air for more than a few seconds risks genuine frostbite. The floorboards beneath your feet are so cold they burn, sending sharp pains shooting up your legs with every step. The simple act of walking across the room becomes an exercise in endurance that would challenge even the most hardened Arctic explorer. Your clothing hangs on pegs near the window, stiff as boards from the overnight freeze. The fabric crackles when you touch it, ice crystals falling like snow from the folds of your dress. Putting on these frozen garments is like wrapping yourself in sheets of ice, each layer adding weight and rigidity rather than warmth and comfort. The buttons are so cold they stick to your fingers, and the laces of your boots have frozen into solid cords that resist every attempt to tie them properly. The kitchen presents its own unique horrors. The pump handle is coated in a layer of ice so thick you need to chip it away with a knife before you can even attempt to draw water. When you finally manage to work the mechanism, what emerges is not the clear, refreshing liquid you expected, but chunks of ice mixed with a thin stream of water so cold it makes your teeth ache just to look at it. The stove, your primary source of both heat and cooking capability, has become your lifeline and your tormentor. The coal scuttle sits nearly empty, each piece of fuel now more precious than gold. You carefully count out enough coal to start a small fire, knowing that this meagre supply must somehow last until your husband can make the treacherous journey to the coal merchant, assuming the roads are even passable. Starting the fire becomes a ritual fraught with anxiety and desperation. Your hands shake so violently from the cold that striking the match requires multiple attempts. The kindling, dampened by the ambient moisture that freezes almost instantly in this temperature, resists ignition with stubborn persistence. Each failed attempt feels like a small death, a step closer to the very real possibility that you might not survive another night in this frozen wasteland that was once your comfortable home. When the fire finally catches, the relief is so profound it brings tears to your eyes. But even this small victory comes with its own challenges. The heat radiates only a few feet from the stove, creating a tiny island of relative warmth in an ocean of bitter cold. Moving away from this precious heat source, even for a moment, means returning to the punishing embrace of winter's fury. Preparing breakfast becomes an epic undertaking that would exhaust a modern person before noon. The bread has frozen solid, requiring careful thawing near the fire to prevent it from crumbling into useless fragments. The milk, delivered yesterday in what now seems like a different lifetime, has expanded as it froze, cracking the ceramic pitcher and creating jagged ice formations that must be carefully melted without destroying the container entirely. Your husband stirs in the bedroom, his movements slow and laboured as he too confronts the reality of this merciless morning. You can hear him coughing, a harsh sound that echoes through the house and reminds you of the very real health dangers that lurk in every frozen breath. The human body simply was not designed to function in these conditions, and you can feel your own respiratory system struggling to process air so cold it seems to crystallize in your lungs. The windows have become abstract art installations of frost, with elaborate patterns spreading across the glass like frozen ferns and flowers. But these beautiful formations come at a cost. They block out what little sunlight might have provided psychological comfort, if not actual warmth, leaving you trapped in a dim, grey world that feels more like a tomb than a home. Outside, you can hear the occasional sound of something cracking under the pressure of the cold. Tree branches snap with reports like gunshots, their sap frozen solid, until the wood can no longer bear the stress. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and then falls silent, as if even the animals understand that conserving energy is now a matter of survival. The simple act of getting dressed reveals just how inadequate your wardrobe is for these unprecedented conditions. Layer upon layer of clothing must be donned, each piece adding bulk but precious little actual insulation. Your corset, normally a symbol of proper feminine presentation, now feels like a cage that restricts the movement you need to generate body heat through activity. The heavy woolen dress that seems so warm in normal winter weather now hangs like a damp shroud, its weight pulling at your shoulders and making every gesture an effort. Your hands, already numb from the brief exposure required for dressing, struggle with the intricate fastenings and buttons that Victorian clothing demands. Each tiny button becomes a monumental challenge when your fingers can barely feel their own movement. The delicate work of arranging your hair, normally a source of pride and feminine accomplishment, becomes a race against frostbite as you try to complete the task before your scalp freezes. The mirror reflects a stranger back at you. Your breath fogs the glass immediately, but in the brief moment before it clouds over, you see the face of someone you barely recognize. Your lips have taken on a bluish tinge that no amount of pinching can restore to their natural color. Your cheeks, rather than glowing with health, appear pale and drawn, as if the cold has literally drained the life from your features. Moving through your daily routine requires constant vigilance and planning. Every task must be approached with the understanding that failure could mean not just inconvenience, but genuine danger. The chamber pot has frozen solid, creating sanitation problems that would horrify modern sensibilities. The wash basin, normally filled with water for morning ablutions, now contains only a solid block of ice that will require careful melting before you can even attempt basic hygiene. Your husband finally emerges from the bedroom, his own appearance shocking in its transformation. The man who just yesterday seemed robust and capable now moves like someone decades older, his joints stiff from the cold and his breathing laboured from the effort of simply existing in these conditions. His beard has collected ice crystals from his breath, creating a bizarre frozen mask that would be comical under any other circumstances. The two of you exchange few words, partly because speaking requires energy you can't spare, but mostly because the cold makes conversation physically painful. Each word you speak sends a puff of warm air from your lungs, air that your body desperately needs to keep circulating, to prevent your core temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. The breakfast preparation continues with agonizing slowness. Every ingredient must be carefully thawed, every utensil warmed before use to prevent it from burning your skin with its frozen metal surface. The simple act of cracking eggs becomes an adventure in itself, as the shells have become brittle as glass from the cold, shattering into dangerous fragments that must be carefully picked from the contents. As you work, you can't help but think about the coal supply, calculating and recalculating how long your meagre reserves might last. The coal merchants' prices have tripled overnight as demand skyrockets and supply routes become impassable. Families throughout Manchester are making impossible choices between heating their homes and feeding their children, between staying warm today and having fuel for tomorrow. The sounds of the neighborhood filtering through the walls tell their own story of struggle and survival. You hear the crash of something heavy falling, followed by muffled cursing as someone else battles the same challenges that confront you. A child's crying echoes from the house next door, a thin, reedy sound that speaks of hunger and cold, and the particular misery that comes when parents have no resources left to provide comfort. Your own stomach gnaws with hunger, but the cold has dulled your appetite to the point where eating feels more like a medical necessity than a pleasure. The act of chewing requires energy, and swallowing cold food sends shocks through your system that make you question whether nutrition is worth the discomfort. The day stretches ahead of you like an Arctic wasteland, filled with tasks that would be simple under normal circumstances, but now represent enormous challenges that will test every ounce of your strength, creativity, and determination to survive. The morning meal, when it finally arrives, tastes of nothing but survival. The porridge, made from oats that had to be chipped from a frozen sack with a hammer, has the consistency of paste and the temperature of barely melted ice. Each spoonful requires conscious effort to swallow, your throat protesting the intrusion of anything that isn't body temperature. The tea, weak from rationed leaves, provides more psychological comfort than physical warmth, though you cradle the chipped ceramic mug between your palms like a precious jewel. Your husband announces his intention to venture to the shop, though you both know this may be impossible. The streets of Manchester have become treacherous corridors of ice and snow drifts that reach past second-story windows in some areas. Reports from neighbours speak of people becoming lost between buildings that stand mere yards apart. The familiar landscape rendered unrecognisable by the relentless accumulation of snow and the complete absence of any recognisable landmarks. The decision of whether to open the shop becomes a calculation of risk versus desperate necessity. The few customers who might brave these conditions represent the difference between having money for coal and food, or watching your family slowly succumb to the dual threats of starvation and freezing. But the journey itself could prove fatal, with temperatures so severe that exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes of contact with the outside air. You help him prepare for the expedition with the solemnity of someone dressing a soldier for battle. Extra layers of clothing, scarves wound around his face until only his eyes remain visible, thick mittens over thinner gloves to provide both dexterity and protection. Every piece of fabric in the house is conscripted into service, creating a bulky figure that can barely move but might survive the quarter-mile walk to the shop. The front door has become an enemy. Ice has sealed it shut so completely that opening it requires both of you putting your full weight against the wooden panel, while using a poker to chip away the frozen barrier. When it finally gives way, the rush of outside air is so brutally cold it takes your breath away completely. The world beyond your threshold has transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow has drifted against buildings in fantastic formations, some reaching heights that completely obscure first-floor windows. The familiar street has vanished beneath a blanket of white so deep and uniform that determining where the road ends and the sidewalk begins becomes impossible. Telegraph poles lean at dangerous angles, weighted down by ice accumulations so thick they've tripled in diameter. Your husband steps into this frozen hellscape with the grim determination of someone who understands he may not return. Each footstep disappears completely into snow so deep it swallows him past his knees. Progress becomes a matter of wading rather than walking, each movement forward requiring enormous physical effort that drains precious body heat with every struggle. Watching him disappear into the white void feels like witnessing a death. The swirling snow obscures visibility so completely that he vanishes from sight before reaching the end of your small front garden. The silence that follows his departure is profound and terrifying, broken only by the constant whisper of wind-driven snow against the windows and the occasional groan of timber somewhere in the neighborhood, succumbing to the impossible weight of accumulated ice. Alone now, you confront the full horror of your situation with crystalline clarity. The fire in the kitchen stove has already begun to diminish, each piece of remaining coal representing hours of potential warmth that must be carefully rationed. The choice between maintaining heat for cooking and preserving fuel for overnight survival becomes a mathematical equation with life or death consequences. The house itself seems to be surrendering to the cold. You can hear strange popping and cracking sounds coming from the walls as the timber contracts beyond its normal limits. Frost begins forming on the interior surfaces of exterior walls, creating delicate white patterns that would be beautiful under any other circumstances, but now represent the visible proof that your shelter is failing to protect you from the elements. Your breath has become a constant visible reminder of the temperature. Each exhalation creates clouds of vapor that linger in the air before dissipating, and you find yourself unconsciously trying to breathe less frequently to conserve the warmth in your lungs. The simple act of existing has become an exercise in energy conservation that requires constant conscious thought and planning. The water situation grows more desperate by the hour. The pump outside has frozen completely solid, making it impossible to draw fresh water for cooking, cleaning, or drinking. The small reserve you managed to collect before the freeze has already begun forming ice crystals around the edges, and you realize that within hours, even this precious supply will be unusable without careful melting. Melting ice and snow for water becomes your primary occupation, a task that consumes enormous amounts of your dwindling fuel supply while producing relatively small quantities of the liquid essential for survival. Each pot of snow yields only a fraction of its volume in water, and the fuel required for the melting process represents hours of potential heating that must be sacrificed for this most basic necessity. The psychological weight of isolation begins to press down upon you with increasing intensity. With your husband gone and no way to communicate with neighbors or the outside world, you exist in a bubble of uncertainty that amplifies every fear and concern. The absence of normal sounds, the familiar noise of daily life that usually provides unconscious comfort, has been replaced by an oppressive quiet that makes every small noise seem ominous and threatening. Hunger gnaws at you with increasing persistence, but the cold has created a cruel paradox. Your body desperately needs fuel in the form of food to generate the energy necessary to maintain body temperature. Yet the process of eating anything cold enough to match your storage conditions sends shockwaves through your system that seem to drain more energy than they provide. The pantry, normally a source of security and abundance, now represents a finite countdown to starvation. Each item must be carefully evaluated, not just for its nutritional value, but for the fuel cost required to make it edible. Root vegetables have frozen solid as stones, requiring significant heating to render them chewable. Preserved meats have become blocks of ice that resist even the sharpest knives. The afternoon brings no relief from the relentless cold, and you begin to understand that this is not simply an unusually harsh winter day, but something unprecedented in its severity and duration. The temperature continues to drop as the weak winter sun provides no meaningful warmth, hidden as it is behind layers of storm clouds that promise only more snow and more punishing cold. Your clothing, despite multiple layers, has become inadequate to the point of being almost useless. The fabric closest to your skin has absorbed moisture from perspiration and breath, creating a damp barrier that actually conducts heat away from your body rather than insulating it. The outer layers have stiffened from the cold until they restrict movement, making every gesture an effort that burns precious calories. The simple task of maintaining the fire becomes an all-consuming occupation that dominates every waking moment. Each piece of coal must be carefully placed to maximize heat output while conserving fuel. The ash must be managed to allow proper air circulation without losing heat through the flue. The delicate balance between too little air, which smothers the flame, and too much air, which wastes heat up the chimney, requires constant adjustment and attention. As evening approaches with its promise of even more brutal temperatures, you realize that your husband should have returned hours ago. The growing darkness brings with it the terrifying possibility that he has become another casualty of this unprecedented weather event, lost somewhere in the white wilderness that Manchester has become. The night ahead looms like a death sentence, promising temperatures that will test the absolute limits of human survival in a building never designed to withstand such extreme conditions. Every decision you make in the next few hours may determine whether you live to see another dawn, or become another statistic in what history will remember as the winter that challenged the very boundaries of human endurance. The candle on your kitchen table flickers with each of your shallow breaths, its flame dancing precariously close to extinction. You've already burned through half your supply of candles, yet darkness still stretches endlessly ahead. The small circle of light it provides seems pathetically inadequate against the vast shadows that have swallowed your home. Shadows that feel colder and more oppressive than mere absence of light should ever be. Your fingers have lost most of their sensation, making the simple task of trimming the candle wick an exercise in blind faith. The metal scissors feel welded to your flesh by the cold, and you must concentrate intensely to maintain your grip. When you finally manage to cut away the excess wick, the brief flare of renewed light reveals frost patterns creeping across the ceiling above your head, delicate crystalline formations that mark the steady advance of winter into every corner of your refuge. The silence outside has become something alive and malevolent. No carriages clatter past on the frozen cobblestones. No voices call out in the streets. Even the ever-present industrial sounds of Manchester, the rhythmic hammering and grinding that normally provides the soundtrack to daily life, have fallen completely silent. The mills have closed, their machinery too frozen to operate, their workers huddled in whatever shelter they can find. You venture toward the front window, each step across the frozen floorboards, sending sharp pains shooting through your feet. The frost on the glass has grown so thick it's become completely opaque, transforming your windows into walls of white crystal. Using your fingernail, you scratch away a small viewing hole, the ice shavings falling like snow onto the windowsill. The world beyond is unrecognizable. What was once a familiar street lined with modest brick houses has become an Arctic wasteland. Snow has drifted so high against some buildings that their front doors have completely disappeared. Telegraph wires hang in graceful swoops, weighted down by ice accumulations so massive they've transformed thin cables into thick white ropes that sway ominously in the wind. A movement in the distance catches your eye. Something dark struggles through the snow, moving with painful slowness toward your house. Your heart hammers against your ribs as you strain to identify the figure. Could it be your husband, finally returning from his perilous journey? Or perhaps a neighbor, equally desperate and seeking shelter or assistance? As the figure draws closer, you recognize the familiar gait and bundled form of your husband, though he moves like a man decades older than his actual years. Each step forward seems to require enormous effort, and several times he stops completely, leaning against invisible supports in the swirling snow. The sight of his struggle fills you with both relief and terror. Relief that he still lives. Terror at the condition he appears to be in. You begin the arduous process of preparing to open the front door, knowing that each second of exposure will cost precious heat from your already inadequately warmed home. The door handle has become so cold it burns your palm even through thick mittens. Ice has reformed in the gaps around the frame, sealing it shut once again with natural cement that requires significant force to break. When the door finally opens, the blast of outside air hits you like a physical blow. The temperature difference is so extreme, it makes your lungs seize, and for a moment you cannot draw breath at all. Your husband stumbles across the threshold, more falling than walking, his clothing so stiff with accumulated ice that it crackles with every movement. His face, what little you can see of it beneath layers of frozen scarves, has taken on a waxy pallor that speaks of severe cold exposure. Icicles hang from his eyebrows and the edges of his mouth, and when he tries to speak, only croaking sounds emerge from his throat. His hands, even protected by multiple layers of mittens and gloves, have lost all dexterity, and he cannot manage the simple task of removing his outer garments. You help him strip away layer after layer of frozen clothing, each piece falling to the floor with the brittle sound of breaking glass. Underneath, his regular clothes are soaked with perspiration that has frozen into a thin sheet of ice against his skin. The sight horrifies you. How long can the human body endure such conditions before permanent damage occurs? Together, you stumble toward the kitchen stove, the only source of heat in your frozen world. He collapses into the single chair positioned near the fire, his entire body shaking with violent tremors that seem to originate from his very bones. You pile every available blanket onto his shoulders, but the shaking continues with mechanical persistence, as if his body has forgotten how to regulate its own temperature. His report of the outside world comes in broken fragments between chattering teeth. The shop never opened. The streets are impassable. The coal merchant's supply has run out completely, and even if coal were available, no cart could navigate the snow-clogged roads to deliver it. Several neighbours have already abandoned their homes, seeking shelter with relatives in warmer regions, though whether they survived their journeys remains unknown. The news about coal hits you like another physical blow. Without fuel for the fire, your survival time can now be measured in hours rather than days. The few pieces remaining in your scuttle might last through the night if carefully rationed, but tomorrow will bring the same brutal cold with no means of combating it. Your husband's breathing gradually returns to something approaching normal, though each exhalation still creates visible clouds in the frigid air of your kitchen. The fire seems pathetically small against the enormous cold that presses in from every direction, and you realize that even huddled directly next to the stove, you're both still slowly losing the battle against the temperature. Food becomes an urgent necessity as both your bodies demand fuel to generate internal heat. The remaining supplies require careful preparation in conditions that make cooking an epic undertaking. Potatoes, frozen solid as rocks, must be slowly thawed near the fire before they can even be peeled. The process consumes precious fuel while producing minimal nutritional return, but without sustenance, your bodies will simply shut down. The evening meal consists of thin soup made from scraps and melted snow, seasoned with desperation and eaten with the grim efficiency of people who understand they're consuming fuel rather than enjoying food. Each spoonful represents a small victory against the cold, though the warmth it provides seems to dissipate almost immediately upon swallowing. As true darkness settles over Manchester, the temperature drops even further. You can actually hear the cold working on your house, the constant creaking and popping of wood contracting beyond its normal limits. Somewhere in the walls, something gives way with a sharp crack that echoes through the rooms like a gunshot. The decision about sleeping arrangements becomes a matter of survival strategy. Your bedroom, located away from the kitchen stove, has become uninhabitable. The very air in that room seems solid with cold, and breathing it feels like inhaling shards of ice. Instead, you drag your mattress into the kitchen, positioning it as close to the stove as safety permits. Even with every blanket in the house piled upon you, the cold penetrates through multiple layers of wool and cotton as if they were tissue paper. You and your husband lie pressed together, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to maintain core temperatures that seem to be dropping despite every effort. Sleep becomes impossible. The cold is too intense, too demanding of constant attention and response. Instead, you lie in a state of exhausted vigilance, listening to the sounds of winter destroying your neighborhood, the crack of tree branches snapping under impossible loads of ice, the groan of building timbers surrendering to forces they were never designed to withstand, the occasional distant sound of something heavy collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow. Your husband's condition continues to worry you as the night progresses. His breathing remains labored, and periodically he's seized by coughing fits that seem to originate deep in his chest. You recognize these as potential signs of pneumonia, a condition that claims many lives during normal winters and would certainly prove fatal under these extreme circumstances. The fire in the stove burns lower and lower despite your careful tending. Each piece of remaining coal must be rationed with mathematical precision, balanced against the need for immediate warmth and the desperate hope that somehow morning might bring relief or rescue. But deep in your heart, you understand that morning will only bring more of the same relentless cold. Your water supply has dwindled to almost nothing. The small pot of melted snow that represented hours of fuel consumption has already been depleted for drinking and the preparation of your meager soup. Tomorrow will require another agonizing choice between using coal to melt more snow for water or preserving fuel to maintain minimal heating. The psychological toll begins to manifest in ways you hadn't anticipated. Simple decisions become overwhelming challenges that require enormous mental effort. The constant stress of calculating fuel consumption, rationing food, and managing heat distribution has exhausted your mental resources as thoroughly as the physical demands have drained your strength. Hallucinations begin to flicker at the edges of your perception. Shadows seem to move independently of their sources. You hear voices calling from rooms you know are empty. Whether these are products of exhaustion, malnutrition, or the early stages of hypothermia, you cannot determine, but their presence adds another layer of horror to your already desperate situation. The night stretches endlessly ahead, each minute feeling like an hour as you struggle to maintain consciousness and body heat. Outside, the wind has picked up again, driving new snow against your windows, with a sound like sand being thrown against glass. Each gust finds new gaps in your home's defenses, sending tiny streams of frigid air through cracks and crevices you never knew existed. Your husband's condition becomes increasingly alarming as the hours pass. His shivering has evolved from violent tremors to weak, intermittent spasms that suggest his body's heating mechanisms are beginning to fail. His skin has taken on a greyish pallor that speaks of circulation problems, and his responses to your attempts at conversation have become increasingly delayed and confused. The reality of your situation crystallizes with terrible clarity. You are trapped in a death trap of ice and cold, with no means of escape and rapidly dwindling resources for survival. The civilized world of Victorian Manchester has been replaced by something primitive and merciless, where human life hangs by the thinnest of threads and survival depends entirely on factors beyond your control. Morning, when it finally arrives, brings no relief whatsoever. The weak winter sun, filtered through layers of storm clouds and falling snow, provides no meaningful warmth or even psychological comfort. If anything, the daylight only makes your situation more apparent by revealing the true extent of the catastrophe that has befallen your city. The coal scuttle now holds perhaps enough fuel for 2 more hours of minimal heating. After that, you will be entirely dependent on whatever combustible materials you can find in your own home. Furniture, books, clothing, anything that will burn becomes potential fuel in the desperate mathematics of survival. Your husband can no longer rise from the makeshift bed near the stove. His condition has deteriorated overnight to the point where simple movement requires assistance, and his breathing has become shallow and irregular. The signs of severe hypothermia are unmistakable, and you realize with growing horror that without immediate medical intervention, he may not survive another night. But medical intervention is impossible. No doctor could navigate the frozen streets to reach your home. And even if one could, what treatment options exist for severe cold exposure when the cold itself cannot be escaped? The morning brings with it the stark realization that you are entirely on your own, facing challenges that would test the limits of human endurance under the best of circumstances. With resources that grow more inadequate with each passing hour, the sound of your own heartbeat becomes unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, each pulse echoing in your ears like a drum marking time toward an inevitable conclusion. You force yourself upright, though every muscle in your body protests the movement with sharp pains that shoot through your limbs like electric shocks. The simple act of sitting requires more energy than you feel capable of producing. Yet remaining motionless means surrendering to the cold that seems determined to claim both you and your husband. The kitchen window reveals a world that has moved beyond winter into something altogether more sinister. Fresh snow continues to fall, adding to drifts that have now completely buried the lower floors of buildings across the street. What were once familiar landmarks have disappeared entirely beneath undulating white expanses that stretch unbroken toward the horizon. The geometry of your neighborhood has been erased, replaced by smooth curves and alien formations that bear no resemblance to the Manchester you knew just days ago. Your husband's labored breathing creates the only sound in your frozen sanctuary, each exhale producing smaller and smaller puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in air so cold it seems to absorb warmth rather than simply lacking it. His lips have developed a distinctly blue tinge that speaks of oxygen deprivation, and when you touch his forehead, his skin feels waxy and unnaturally cold despite the blankets piled upon him. The remaining coal in your scuttle has dwindled to perhaps a dozen pieces, each one now more precious than diamonds. You select a single lump with the careful deliberation of someone making a life or death decision, because that is precisely what this has become. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. Each piece of coal represents approximately 30 minutes of heat, and you have perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining before your fire dies completely. Adding the coal to your struggling fire produces a brief flare of warmth that feels almost violent in its intensity. For a few precious moments, the temperature near the stove rises enough that you can actually feel your fingers again, sensation returning in painful tingles that remind you how close to frostbite you have already come. But the warmth radiates only inches from the source, and beyond that small circle of relative comfort, the cold presses in with renewed fury. The water situation has become critical beyond any reasonable solution. Your last pot of melted snow has frozen solid overnight, despite being positioned near the fire, creating a block of ice that will require precious fuel to render useful again. The pump outside remains completely inaccessible, buried beneath snow and ice to a depth that makes excavation impossible, even if you possess the strength and tools for such an undertaking. Hunger gnaws at your stomach with increasing persistence. But your food supplies present challenges that seem designed by some cruel fate to mock your desperation. The remaining bread has achieved a hardness that defies cutting, requiring careful warming near the fire to become even marginally edible. The process consumes fuel you cannot spare while producing sustenance that provides minimal energy return for the investment required. Your husband stirs restlessly on the makeshift bed, muttering words that make no sense in any language you recognize. His eyes, when they occasionally flutter open, seem to focus on things that exist only in his increasingly confused mind. You recognize these as symptoms of severe hypothermia affecting his cognitive function, and the knowledge fills you with a despair so profound It threatens to overwhelm your determination to continue fighting. The house itself has become an active participant in your struggle for survival. You can hear new sounds throughout the structure, the constant adjustment and protest of materials being pushed beyond their design limits. Pipes have burst somewhere in the walls, creating mysterious dripping sounds that speak of water damage you cannot address, and structural problems that will outlast this crisis, assuming anyone survives to deal with them. Ice has begun forming on the interior surfaces of your kitchen walls, delicate crystalline patterns that would be beautiful under any other circumstances, but now represent visible proof that your shelter is failing in its most basic function. The cold is no longer something outside trying to get in, but has become an occupying force that has established permanent residence throughout your home. Your clothing has become a burden rather than protection. Multiple layers of fabric, dampened by perspiration and breath, have created a clammy barrier that seems to conduct heat away from your body rather than preserving it. Yet removing any layers means exposing skin to air so cold it burns on contact, creating an impossible choice between different forms of discomfort that both lead toward the same fatal conclusion. The psychological effects of prolonged cold exposure begin manifesting in ways that frighten you almost as much as the physical symptoms. Simple thoughts require enormous effort to complete, and you find yourself staring blankly at familiar objects for long periods without being able to remember what you intended to do with them. The spoon in your hand might have been there for minutes or hours. You cannot tell which, and the distinction seems less important than it should. Time itself has become elastic and unreliable. Minutes stretch into what feel like hours, while entire periods disappear from your memory without explanation. The weak daylight filtering through your frost-covered windows provides no reliable indication of the actual time, and your clock stopped working sometime during the night when its mechanism froze solid. Your husband's condition continues to deteriorate with frightening speed. His responses to your voice have become increasingly delayed and inappropriate, and several times he has called you by names of people you have never heard him mention before. His body temperature, despite every blanket and covering you can pile upon him, feels cold to your touch, even through multiple layers of fabric. The fire in your stove burns lower with each passing minute, each flame representing seconds of life ticking away toward an inevitable conclusion. You find yourself staring into the glowing coals with an intensity that borders on obsession, as if your concentrated attention might somehow slow their consumption or extract additional heat through sheer force of will. Outside, something large crashes to the ground with a sound that reverberates through the frozen air like thunder. Whether a tree, a building, or some structure collapsing under the impossible weight of accumulated snow and ice, you cannot determine, but the sound serves as a reminder that your neighborhood is being systematically destroyed by forces that care nothing for human comfort or survival. The remaining food in your pantry presents choices that would have seemed absurd just a week ago, but now require careful consideration of energy expenditure versus nutritional return. Each potato that must be thawed requires fuel that might be better used for heating. Each piece of preserved meat that needs warming consumes coal that could extend your heating supply by precious additional minutes. Your body has begun consuming itself for fuel, breaking down muscle tissue to generate the energy needed to maintain core temperature. You can feel yourself growing weaker by the hour, each movement requiring conscious effort that once would have been automatic. Simple tasks like adding coal to the fire or adjusting blankets become monumental undertakings that leave you exhausted and gasping. The silence outside has taken on an almost supernatural quality, as if the entire world has been muffled beneath layers of snow and ice so thick that sound itself cannot penetrate. No church bells mark the hours, no voices call from neighbouring houses. Even the wind has died to barely a whisper, leaving you trapped in a bubble of quietude that makes every small noise in your house seem unnaturally loud and significant. Your husband's breathing has become increasingly irregular, long periods of silence followed by sudden gasping intakes that suggest his body is struggling to maintain even the most basic functions. You press your ear to his chest and can hear his heartbeat, rapid and fluttery like a bird trapped in a cage, working frantically to circulate blood through extremities that have already begun shutting down to preserve vital organs. The coal scuttle now holds perhaps enough fuel for 3 more hours if carefully rationed, or 2 hours if used more generously to provide actual comfort, rather than mere survival. The choice between extending your agony and ending it more quickly with a few hours of relative warmth becomes a decision that no human being should ever have to make. You begin taking inventory of anything in your house that might burn once the coal runs out. Furniture can be broken up and fed to the fire, though the energy required to dismantle wooden chairs and tables might exceed the heat value they would provide. Books will burn readily, but produce little sustained heat. Clothing might provide temporary warmth, but at the cost of insulation you desperately need to maintain. The morning light, such as it is, reveals that snow continues to fall with relentless consistency. Rather than the large, fluffy flakes of ordinary winter storms, this precipitation consists of small, hard crystals that strike the windows with tiny ticking sounds and seem to pack together with unusual density. The accumulation rate appears to be accelerating rather than diminishing, suggesting that conditions will continue worsening rather than improving. Your water supply has reached the point where every drop must be carefully considered and rationed. The small amount you managed to melt from snow yesterday has already been consumed, and the energy cost of producing more liquid from ice may exceed your fuel capacity. Dehydration becomes another enemy in your growing list of threats, one that will weaken you even faster than hunger or cold alone. The psychological challenge of maintaining hope becomes as difficult as any physical hardship you face. Every logical calculation points toward the same inevitable conclusion, yet some primitive part of your mind continues to search for solutions that rational thought knows do not exist. The human capacity for denial in the face of overwhelming evidence becomes both a blessing and a curse, providing motivation to continue while preventing realistic assessment of your actual situation. Your husband calls out suddenly, his voice startlingly clear after hours of mumbling incoherence. He speaks your name with perfect clarity, then asks about visiting his mother for Sunday dinner, apparently unaware that his mother died 3 years ago, or that Sunday dinners are luxuries that belong to a world of warmth and plenty that no longer exists. The confusion in his voice breaks your heart more completely than his physical deterioration, because it represents the loss of the man you married to an enemy that attacks not just the body, but the very essence of human consciousness. You respond as if his question makes perfect sense, agreeing that yes, you should visit his mother soon, because maintaining his emotional comfort seems more important than correcting his understanding of reality. The fire burns lower with each passing moment, and you realize that your next decision about fuel consumption may be your last opportunity to make such a choice. The remaining coal can either provide a few more hours of minimal heating that merely delays the inevitable, or it can create a brief period of actual warmth that might restore some measure of human dignity to your final hours together. The mathematics of survival have reduced your existence to the most primitive calculations. Calories consumed versus energy expended, fuel burned versus heat produced, time remaining versus resources available. Each equation leads to the same conclusion, yet some stubborn part of your spirit refuses to accept the obvious answer. Outside your frost-covered window, the world continues its transformation into something alien and hostile. The familiar sounds of civilization have been replaced by the occasional crack of something breaking under pressure, the whisper of wind-driven snow, and the profound silence that comes when an entire city has been forced into submission by forces beyond human control. Your body has begun the process of shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature, a biological response that manifests in increasingly sluggish thoughts and movements that require conscious effort to complete. The simple act of reaching for another piece of coal becomes a complex operation that must be planned and executed with the careful precision of someone whose coordination can no longer be taken for granted. The remaining daylight hours stretch ahead, like a frozen eternity, each minute requiring the same desperate calculations about resource allocation and survival strategy. Every breath you take represents energy expended. Every movement consumes calories you cannot spare. Every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond its immediate effects. Yet somehow, despite the overwhelming evidence that your situation has moved beyond hope into the realm of mere endurance, you continue to tend the fire, continue to care for your husband, continue to make the small choices that define the difference between surrendering to despair and maintaining the essential human dignity that separates survival from mere existence. The coal scuttle holds perhaps 2 hours of fuel, and the day is only beginning. The decision weighs upon you with crushing finality. 2 pieces of coal remain in the scuttle, each representing perhaps 40 minutes of precious heat. Your husband lies motionless, except for the irregular rise and fall of his chest, his breathing so shallow you must watch carefully to confirm he still lives. The choice before you transcends mere survival mathematics and enters the realm of human dignity. You select both pieces with trembling fingers that can barely maintain their grip on the frozen lumps. If death comes today, it will find you warm. The coal falls into the glowing embers with a soft thud that seems to echo through your frozen kitchen like a bell tolling the hours. The flames leap higher than they have in days, casting dancing shadows on walls that glisten with interior frost. For the first time since this nightmare began, genuine warmth radiates beyond the immediate vicinity of the stove. The sensation is so profound, so completely unexpected, that tears spring to your eyes and freeze on your cheeks before they can fall. You pull your chair closer to the fire and allow yourself the luxury of removing one layer of mittens, flexing fingers that tingle painfully as sensation returns. Your husband stirs at the increased warmth, his eyes opening with something approaching clarity for the first time in hours. He looks at you with recognition, and for a precious moment, the man you married returns from wherever hypothermia had taken him. His lips, still blue but no longer the frightening grey they had become, move in an attempt to speak. The words emerge as barely a whisper, but you understand them perfectly. He apologizes for leaving you alone in this frozen hell, as if the weather were somehow his personal failing, rather than an act of nature beyond any human control. You take his hand, shocked by how cold his skin feels, even through your remaining mittens, and tell him there is nothing to forgive. The increased heat allows you to attempt something that would have been impossible hours earlier. You manage to melt enough snow to create a cup of weak tea, the first warm liquid either of you has consumed since yesterday. The process requires careful rationing of your newfound warmth, positioning the pot close enough to the flames to achieve melting without sacrificing the direct heat you both desperately need. The tea tastes of nothing but hot water and hope, yet drinking it feels like the most luxurious experience imaginable. The warmth travels down your throat and spreads through your chest, creating a sensation of internal heat that your body had almost forgotten was possible. You help your husband sip from the cup, watching colour return to his lips with each small swallow. Outside, the world continues its relentless transformation. Through your small, scratched viewing hole in the frosted window, you can see that snow has now drifted so high against the house across the street that only its chimney remains visible above the white expanse. Telegraph poles have disappeared entirely, leaving no indication that a street ever existed in this alien landscape. The warmth from your generous fire creates a temporary island of humanity in the frozen wasteland your home has become. For these precious hours, you can think clearly, move without agony, and remember what it feels like to be human, rather than merely a collection of biological functions struggling against inevitable shutdown. The psychological relief is almost as profound as the physical comfort. Your husband manages to sit upright with assistance, the first time he has achieved this position since returning from his harrowing journey to the shop. His movements remain slow and deliberate, but the confused muttering has ceased, and his responses to your voice carry the coherence that had been absent throughout the long, terrible night. The improved conditions allow you to take proper inventory of your remaining resources. The food situation is dire, but not immediately fatal. A few potatoes, some hardened bread, and perhaps 2 days' worth of preserved meat, if carefully rationed. Without fuel to cook properly, these supplies become academic rather than practical, but their presence provides psychological comfort that extends beyond their nutritional value. Your water reserves consist entirely of snow that must be melted, a process that will become impossible once your fire dies. You position every available container near the stove to capture maximum melting capacity while the heat lasts, creating a small reservoir of liquid that might sustain you for perhaps another day if used sparingly. The house around you tells its own story of surrender to the impossible cold. Wallpaper has begun peeling where moisture froze and expanded behind the paste. Floorboards have contracted so severely that gaps have opened between them, creating tiny channels for cold air to infiltrate even your warmest room. The very structure of your home is being systematically destroyed by temperatures it was never designed to withstand. Your husband speaks for the first time in hours, his voice weak but rational as he describes his journey to the shop. The streets had become impassable canyons carved through snowdrifts that reached heights of 10 feet or more. Buildings stood like islands in a frozen sea, their lower floors completely buried beneath accumulations that transformed Manchester's familiar geography into something unrecognizable. The shop owners who had managed to reach their establishments found customers non-existent and supply lines completely severed. Coal merchants reported that their last deliveries had been made 3 days ago, before the full severity of the storm became apparent. No new shipments could reach the city through roads blocked by snow and ice, and no existing supplies remained to purchase at any price. He had encountered other men attempting similar desperate journeys, all reporting the same devastating news. Food supplies throughout the city were rapidly depleting. Medical services had ceased functioning entirely. Even the postal system, that symbol of Victorian reliability and efficiency, had suspended all operations indefinitely. Manchester had become an isolated island in a frozen ocean, cut off from all external assistance or supply. The social fabric of your neighborhood was beginning to unravel under the pressure of unprecedented hardship. Families with young children had begun abandoning their homes, attempting dangerous journeys to relatives in warmer regions, despite roads that claimed lives daily. Others had barricaded themselves in their houses with whatever supplies they possessed, refusing to answer doors or acknowledge neighbors' pleas for assistance. Reports circulated of people burning furniture, books, and even structural elements of their homes in desperate attempts to maintain heating. Some families had moved entirely into single rooms, abandoning the rest of their houses to the cold, while focusing their meager resources on defending one small space against the advancing winter. Your husband's account of the morning's expedition reveals the true scope of the catastrophe. This is not simply an unusually harsh winter storm, but a weather event of unprecedented severity that has overwhelmed every system and resource that civilized society depends upon for survival. The comfortable assumptions of Victorian life, the reliable delivery of coal and food, the accessibility of medical care, the basic infrastructure that makes urban living possible, have all collapsed under the weight of impossible cold. The warmth from your sacrificial fire begins to diminish as the coal burns through its accelerated consumption. You can feel the temperature starting to drop even as you sit directly beside the stove, and you realize that your brief reprieve is drawing to its inevitable close. The return to desperate cold will be even more difficult now that your body has remembered what comfort feels like. Your husband seems to understand the mathematics as clearly as you do. His improved clarity of thought has restored his ability to calculate fuel consumption and remaining supplies with the same grim precision that occupies your own mind. Neither of you speaks of the obvious conclusion, but both understand that you have perhaps 6 hours of minimal heating remaining before the fire dies completely. The afternoon light filtering through your frost-covered windows provides no warmth, only the psychological comfort of knowing that somewhere beyond the storm, the sun still exists. The snow continues falling with mechanical persistence, adding to accumulations that have already surpassed anything in recorded memory. Weather patterns that should have moved through the region days ago seem locked in place by atmospheric conditions that no meteorologist could have predicted or prepared for. Your husband reaches for your hand with fingers that still tremble from cold, despite the temporary warmth. His grip feels fragile, as if the bones beneath his skin have become hollow and brittle from exposure to temperatures that challenge the basic chemistry of human survival. Yet his eyes hold a clarity and determination that speaks of decisions made and accepted, with whatever dignity remains available. The conversation that follows requires no words. You both understand what the next hours will bring, what choices remain available, and what outcomes await regardless of the decisions you make. The fire will die. The cold will return with renewed fury. Your bodies, already pushed beyond their design limits, will face challenges that exceed any reasonable expectation of survival. Yet in this moment of temporary warmth and restored human connection, something essential reasserts itself against the mechanical brutality of winter's assault. Love persists despite impossible circumstances. Dignity survives, even when hope has been systematically destroyed. The fundamental human capacity to care for one another transcends the mere biological imperative for individual survival. You spend these precious warm hours not in desperate preparation for the ordeal ahead, but in quiet companionship that acknowledges both the gravity of your situation and the profound meaning found in sharing whatever time remains. The fire burns lower with each passing minute, but its light illuminates something more valuable than mere physical warmth. Your husband tells you about the morning sky he glimpsed during his journey, how even through the storm clouds and falling snow, he could sense the presence of something vast and beautiful beyond the immediate horror of your circumstances. The cold that threatens to destroy you both is part of something larger, more complex than simple malevolence. It is indifferent rather than cruel, following natural laws that care nothing for human comfort, but operate according to principles that have shaped the world for countless ages. The philosophical acceptance in his voice surprises you with its calm certainty. This is not resignation or defeat, but rather a mature acknowledgement of humanity's place in natural systems that operate on scales far beyond individual human experience. The storm that threatens your lives is the same force that shapes mountain ranges and carves river valleys, that creates the very landscape that makes life possible during gentler seasons. This perspective provides an unexpected form of comfort as you watch your fire burn lower. You are participants in something ancient and fundamental, not merely victims of random misfortune. The cold that challenges your survival has been testing life on Earth for millions of years, creating the selective pressures that forged every adaptation that allows any creature to exist in winter climates. Your struggle becomes part of a larger story that extends far beyond your individual experience, connecting you to countless other humans who have faced similar challenges throughout history. Every winter that has ever tested human endurance, every fire that has ever meant the difference between life and death, every couple that has ever faced impossible circumstances together contributes to the tradition of which you now form a part. The fire burns lower still, but your sense of isolation diminishes rather than increases. You are not alone in this frozen house, but connected through shared experience to every human being who has ever fought against overwhelming odds for one more day, one more hour, one more moment of conscious existence in a universe that provides no guarantees about survival or comfort. Your husband's breathing has stabilized in the warmth. though it remains labored and shallow. His color has improved enough that you no longer fear immediate collapse, though you both understand that this reprieve is temporary and will end when the fire dies. The time you have purchased with your last coal burns away minute by minute, each moment both precious and finite. The house settles around you with sounds that speak of structural surrender to forces beyond its capacity to resist. Yet it continues to provide shelter, continues to offer some barrier between your fragile human bodies and the full fury of the storm outside. Even in its failure, even as its systems collapse and its defenses prove inadequate, your home maintains its essential function of creating a space where human life can persist for just a little longer. The snow outside continues its relentless accumulation, each flake adding infinitesimal weight to drifts that have already transformed your neighborhood beyond recognition. Yet each flake is also part of the water cycle that makes all life possible, part of the atmospheric system that distributes heat and moisture across the planet in patterns that generally support rather than threaten human existence. Your fire burns lower, but something else burns brighter in the warmth it has provided. Call it love, call it dignity, call it the irreducible human spirit that persists even when every rational calculation suggests surrender. Whatever name you give it, this flame requires no fuel and produces a warmth that no winter can entirely extinguish. The remaining coals glow with diminishing intensity, their red heat fading toward the grey ash that will mark the end of your last defense against the cold. Yet in these final warm moments, you discover resources you had not known you possessed, reserves of strength and grace that emerge only when everything else has been stripped away. Your husband squeezes your hand with fingers that have regained enough sensation to communicate tenderness along with determination. The gesture says everything that words could express and more besides. Whatever comes next, you will face it together with whatever dignity and courage remain available to ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. The fire burns lower, the cold presses closer, and the long afternoon stretches ahead toward an evening that will test every assumption you have ever held about the limits of human endurance. Yet something essential has been preserved in these warm hours, something that no amount of cold can touch or destroy. The last flames flicker and dance above coals that glow like tiny suns in your frozen kitchen. Each spark a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, light continues to exist for those who have learned to see it. The coals settle into their final arrangement with soft whispers and occasional pops, each sound marking another step toward the inevitable return of merciless cold. You watch the last flames dance with hypnotic fascination, knowing that when they die, your brief reprieve from winter's assault will end. The temperature in your kitchen has already begun its relentless descent, though the change is so gradual that your heat-starved body clings to every degree with desperate gratitude. Your husband's improved condition allows him to help you prepare for what comes next, though both of you understand the preparations are more ritual than practical solution. Together, you drag every piece of furniture that might burn closer to the stove, creating a small fortress of potential fuel around your diminishing fire. The wooden kitchen chairs, the small side table, even the cutting board from your food preparation area become candidates for sacrifice to the flames. The process of dismantling furniture requires tools you do not possess and strength your bodies can barely muster. The kitchen chairs resist destruction with stubborn persistence, their joints held together by craftsmanship designed to last generations rather than provide emergency heating. Your attempts to break them apart by force prove futile, serving only to exhaust energy reserves you cannot afford to waste. Your husband discovers that the poker from your fireplace set can be used to pry apart some of the simpler joints, though the work proceeds with agonizing slowness. Each piece of wood extracted from furniture represents perhaps 10 minutes of additional heat, a calculation that makes the enormous effort required seem almost worthwhile. The destruction of your household goods carries emotional weight beyond their practical value, marking the systematic dismantling of the domestic life you had built together. The bread box yields easily to dismantling, its thin wooden sides separating cleanly to provide kindling that will burn quickly but brightly. The small bookshelf in the corner proves more challenging, its sturdy construction requiring concentrated effort that leaves both of you gasping in the cold air. Yet each board you manage to extract represents hope measured in minutes of warmth. Books themselves present another category of potential fuel, though burning them feels like destroying pieces of civilization itself. The leather-bound volumes that represented education and culture in your former life now become candidates for conversion into heat energy. You select the largest volumes first, calculating that thicker books will burn longer and provide more sustained warmth than thinner texts. The moral weight of burning books troubles you more than destroying furniture, as if you are participating in the systematic elimination of human knowledge rather than simply trying to survive. Yet survival trumps sentiment, and you carefully tear pages from volumes that once provided intellectual nourishment, preparing them as tinder for the wooden furniture that will follow. Your clothing presents the most complex fuel calculations. Burning fabric provides quick heat but little sustained warmth, while reducing the insulation layers you desperately need to maintain body temperature. The choice between immediate heat and continued protection becomes another impossible decision in your growing collection of survival paradoxes. You decide to sacrifice some of your undergarments, items that provide less visible insulation but still contribute to your overall warmth retention. The cotton and linen burn readily, producing brief flares of heat that feel almost violent in their intensity before quickly consuming themselves and returning you to the advancing cold. Your husband's extra shirt becomes another casualty, torn into strips that will serve as kindling to help ignite the more substantial wooden fuel. The process of destroying clothing that might be needed later requires a psychological shift from planning for future survival to focusing entirely on immediate needs. The last coals in your stove have faded to dim red embers that provide more light than heat, glowing like tiny eyes in the gathering darkness of your kitchen. The moment has arrived to begin feeding your makeshift fuel to the dying fire, starting with the smallest pieces and working toward larger items as the flames hopefully establish themselves. The first pieces of torn book pages catch immediately, creating a brief resurrection of flame that fills you with disproportionate joy. The fire climbs eagerly through the paper fuel, consuming months of carefully saved reading material in seconds while providing precious moments of renewed warmth. You feed more pages to the growing flames, watching literature transform into life-sustaining heat. The wooden pieces from your dismantled furniture prove more challenging to ignite than you had hoped. The cold has penetrated so deeply into the wood that it resists catching fire despite the paper kindling beneath it. You blow gently on the flames, trying to provide additional oxygen without extinguishing the delicate combustion process. Gradually, persistence pays off as the wood begins to smolder and then catch. The flames spread along the grain of the dismantled chair legs, producing the first substantial heat you have felt since your last coal burned away. The warmth radiates outward from the stove with blessed intensity, though you know this reprieve will be even briefer than your coal-fueled respite. Your husband manages to break off another piece of furniture, their effort leaving him exhausted, but providing additional fuel for the growing fire. The flames leap higher as fresh wood is added, casting dancing shadows on walls that glisten with accumulated frost. For a few precious minutes, your kitchen feels almost habitable again. The psychological effect of renewed fire proves as important as the physical warmth it provides. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions in your current circumstances, begins to stir again despite every rational argument against optimism. Perhaps you can sustain this makeshift heating system long enough for conditions to improve. Perhaps rescue will arrive before your improvised fuel supply runs out. But even as hope flickers to life, cold reality reasserts itself through simple mathematics. The furniture in your kitchen will provide perhaps 4 hours of heating if burned efficiently. After that, you would need to venture into other rooms to harvest additional combustible materials, a prospect that becomes less feasible as your strength diminishes and the cold intensifies. The fire burns through your furniture fuel with alarming speed, consuming in minutes what took hours to prepare. Each piece of wood represents not just potential heat, but also the destruction of possessions that defined your domestic life. Your home is literally consuming itself in a desperate attempt to preserve the lives it was built to shelter. Your husband points out that the wooden interior doors throughout the house could provide substantial fuel, though removing them would eliminate what little barrier exists between heated and unheated spaces. The decision requires weighing immediate heat needs against the longer-term benefits of maintaining some temperature differential within your home. The front door itself represents perhaps 2 hours of fuel, but burning it would eliminate your primary barrier against the outside world while providing no means of escape should rescue somehow arrive. The calculation becomes increasingly complex as each potential fuel source carries consequences that extend beyond simple heat production. Your water supply, carefully accumulated during your brief warm period, has already begun forming ice crystals around the edges despite being positioned near the fire. The site reminds you that even your current heating efforts are insufficient to maintain temperatures above freezing throughout your kitchen. You are merely slowing the advance of cold rather than defeating it. The afternoon light continues its weak passage across frost-covered windows, providing no warmth but marking the relentless progression of time toward an evening that will bring even more brutal temperatures. Weather patterns show no sign of improvement, with snow continuing to fall and wind beginning to pick up again as another front approaches your already devastated region. Your husband's breathing has remained stable in the renewed warmth, though you can see the effort each breath requires. His color has improved enough that immediate collapse seems less likely, but the underlying damage from prolonged cold exposure continues to affect his cardiovascular and respiratory systems in ways that will persist long after this crisis ends. The fire burns lower as your furniture fuel is consumed with mechanical efficiency. Each piece of wood transforms into heat and ash with the same indifferent thoroughness, providing temporary warmth before joining the growing pile of grey powder that represents your dismantled domestic life. You feed the flames with increasing frequency, trying to maintain heat output as the available fuel dwindles. Your clothing has become a complex system of layers that trap what little body heat you can generate while providing access to remove items for burning as needed. The outermost garments have stiffened from accumulated moisture and cold, creating a shell that restricts movement while providing minimal insulation value. The decision to burn additional clothing becomes increasingly urgent as the wooden fuel supply approaches exhaustion. Each garment represents both immediate heating potential and long-term insulation loss, creating calculations that have no clear answers. You select items based on their burning characteristics rather than their practical value, choosing cotton over wool for its faster ignition. Your husband removes his outer vest, adding it to the pile of potential fuel with the resigned determination of someone who understands that all possessions have become negotiable in the mathematics of survival. The vest burns quickly, providing a brief flare of intense heat before consuming itself completely. The process of systematic destruction continues with methodical persistence, each item sacrificed to the flames, bringing you closer to the moment when nothing remains to burn. Books, furniture, clothing, and household goods all transform into temporary heat and permanent ash, marking the steady elimination of everything that once defined your material existence. Your kitchen, once the heart of domestic life where meals were prepared and family conversations took place, has become a triage center where every object is evaluated solely for its potential to extend life by a few more minutes. The transformation feels complete and irreversible, as if the cold has rewritten the fundamental purpose of human habitation. The fire burns with increasing hunger as you feed it whatever materials you can prepare for consumption. Yet each feeding cycle provides diminishing returns. the heat output declining as your fuel quality decreases, and your ability to prepare proper kindling deteriorates with exhaustion and cold. Your husband works methodically to break apart the remaining furniture, his movements slow but determined as he prepares the next batch of fuel for the insatiable flames. The work generates some body heat through physical activity, though the energy expenditure may exceed the warming benefits of movement in air this cold. The afternoon progresses with mechanical regularity, each hour marked by the systematic consumption of another piece of your former life. The fire demands constant attention and feeding, becoming a demanding master that controls every aspect of your existence, while providing barely adequate compensation in the form of temporary warmth. Your water reserves have stabilized at a level that might sustain you for another day if carefully rationed, though the containers must be kept close to the fire to prevent refreezing. The liquid represents life itself, more precious than any possession you have burned, and more essential than any comfort you have sacrificed. The food situation remains dire but manageable for perhaps 2 more days, if you can maintain enough heat to make consumption possible. The preserved meat requires warming to become digestible, while the remaining vegetables need thawing to become accessible. Every meal becomes an exercise in fuel management that competes directly with heating needs. Your husband's condition continues to stabilize in the renewed warmth, though you both understand that improvement depends entirely on maintaining heat output that consumes resources faster than they can be replaced. The mathematical certainty of fuel exhaustion hangs over every moment of comfort like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. The house around you tells its own story of systematic surrender to impossible conditions. Pipes have burst throughout the structure, creating water damage that will require extensive repairs, assuming anyone survives to undertake them. Wallpaper peels where expanding ice has destroyed the adhesive, while floorboards separate as the wood contracts beyond its normal limits. Your home is being destroyed from within by the same forces that threaten your lives, transformed from shelter into another casualty of weather conditions that exceed every reasonable expectation of what buildings and bodies can endure. The process feels like watching civilization itself slowly dissolve under the pressure of natural forces that recognize no human authority or achievement. The fire burns lower despite your constant attention, each flame representing seconds of life ticking away toward an inevitable conclusion. Yet something persists, beyond the mere biological imperative for survival, some essential human quality that refuses to be reduced to simple thermodynamics and resource management. Your husband reaches for your hand again, his grip stronger now but still trembling with the ongoing effects of severe cold exposure. His eyes hold a clarity that speaks of decisions made and accepted, of love that transcends circumstances, and dignity that survives even when hope has been systematically eliminated by mathematical certainty. The conversation that passes between you requires no words, communicating through touch and shared understanding what language could never adequately express. You have found something in these impossible circumstances that many people never discover in lifetimes of comfort and security, a connection that strips away everything non-essential and reveals what actually matters when everything else has been taken away. The fire burns lower, the cold presses closer, and evening approaches with its promise of temperatures that will test every assumption about the limits of human endurance. Yet in this moment, surrounded by the ash of your former life, and facing circumstances that offer no reasonable hope of survival, you discover reserves of strength and grace that emerge only when everything else has been stripped away. Your husband speaks softly about the morning sky he glimpsed during his desperate journey, how even through storm clouds and falling snow, he sensed something vast and beautiful beyond the immediate horror of your situation. His words carry a philosophical acceptance that surprises you with its calm certainty, not resignation, but mature acknowledgement of humanity's place in natural systems that operate according to principles far beyond individual human experience. The storm that threatens your lives is the same force that shapes landscapes and creates the very conditions that make existence possible during gentler seasons. Your struggle becomes part of something ancient and fundamental, connecting you to countless others who have faced similar challenges throughout human history. Every winter that has ever tested human endurance, every fire that has ever meant the difference between life and death, every couple that has ever confronted impossible circumstances together contributes to the tradition of which you now form a part. You are not alone in this frozen kitchen, but connected through shared experience to every human being who has ever fought against overwhelming odds for one more moment of conscious existence. The fire burns lower still, but your sense of isolation diminishes rather than increases. Something essential burns brighter in the warmth it has provided, a flame that requires no fuel and produces a warmth that no winter can entirely extinguish. Whatever comes next, you will face it together, with whatever dignity and courage remain available to ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. The last pieces of furniture feed the dying flames as afternoon fades toward an evening that will bring new challenges and test every resource you have discovered within yourselves. Yet something fundamental has been preserved in these hours, something that no amount of cold can touch or destroy. The fire burns lower, the shadows lengthen, and the longest night of your lives approaches with mechanical inevitability. The fire collapses into itself with a soft sigh, the last piece of your kitchen chair leg crumbling into glowing embers that pulse like dying heartbeats in the gathering dusk. The temperature drops so immediately and dramatically that you can actually feel the cold rushing back into your small sanctuary, reclaiming territory it had only temporarily surrendered. Your breath becomes visible again within minutes, small puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in air that seems hungry for any trace of warmth. Your husband's face, which had shown such improvement during your brief respite, begins to take on that waxy pallor again as the heat bleeds away into the frozen walls. His breathing, steady for these precious hours, becomes labored once more, as his body redirects energy from non-essential functions to the desperate task of maintaining core temperature. You watch this transformation with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a flower wilt in fast motion. The kitchen transforms around you with alarming speed. Surfaces that had been merely cold become painful to touch. The air itself seems to thicken, each breath requiring conscious effort as your lungs struggle to process atmosphere so frigid it crystallizes moisture before it can reach your bloodstream. The frost patterns on your walls, temporarily halted by the furniture fire, resume their inexorable advance across every surface. Your remaining possessions take on new significance as potential fuel sources. The wooden spoons in your drawer, each one carved by your husband during the early months of your marriage, become candidates for sacrifice to flames that demand constant feeding. The small wooden box that holds your few pieces of jewelry transforms from sentimental keepsake to potential kindling that might provide another 10 minutes of heat. You begin the systematic evaluation of every combustible item within reach, your mind automatically calculating burning time versus preparation effort for objects that once held entirely different meanings. The wooden handles of kitchen knives, the small decorative shelf that holds your few remaining dishes, even the wooden pegs from which your clothes hang, all become entries in a grim ledger of survival mathematics. The process of preparing these items for burning requires energy expenditure that may exceed their heat value, yet the alternative is accepting the cold's final victory. Your hands, already numb despite the mittens, struggle with the fine motor control needed to break apart small wooden objects or tear fabric into proper kindling size. Each task becomes a race against the advancing cold that stiffens your joints and clouds your thinking. Your husband attempts to help despite his weakened condition, his movements slow and deliberate as he works to dismantle the small wooden stool that serves as your only remaining seating. The joints resist separation with stubborn persistence, requiring repeated attempts with tools inadequate for the task. The poker becomes your primary implement, serving as pry bar, hammer, and lever in the desperate work of converting household goods into fuel. The effort of destruction generates some body heat through physical activity, though you question whether the energy expenditure exceeds the warming benefits in air this hostile to human existence. Every movement sends sharp pains through muscles that have contracted beyond their normal range, while joints protest with grinding sensations that speak of damage accumulating faster than your body can repair it. Your water containers have begun forming ice shells despite their proximity to where the fire recently burned, thin crystalline barriers that must be broken before you can access the liquid beneath. The sight serves as a visceral reminder that even your most heroic heating efforts are insufficient to maintain temperatures above freezing throughout your kitchen. You are merely negotiating the terms of surrender rather than achieving victory. The small pile of wooden debris you manage to accumulate represents perhaps 30 minutes of burning time if used efficiently, though efficiency becomes increasingly difficult as your coordination deteriorates with cold and exhaustion. Each piece must be carefully sized to catch fire readily while burning long enough to justify the fuel needed for ignition. The calculations grow more complex as your available resources dwindle towards zero. Starting a new fire with your improvised fuel proves more challenging than anticipated. The wooden fragments, permeated with cold and moisture, resist ignition despite your careful preparation of paper kindling. The matches, already reduced to a precious few, become instruments too valuable to waste on unsuccessful attempts. Each strike must be planned and executed with surgical precision. Your hands shake so violently that holding a match steady becomes nearly impossible, while the cold has reduced your fine motor control to the level of a small child attempting complex manipulations. The simple act of striking the match requires multiple attempts, each failure bringing you closer to the moment when no more attempts will be possible. When the tiny flame finally catches, the relief is so profound it brings tears that freeze before they can fall. The fire climbs eagerly through your paper kindling, consuming pages torn from the household ledger where you once recorded grocery purchases and social obligations that now seem to belong to another lifetime entirely. The flames spread to the wooden fragments with agonizing slowness, each piece requiring careful coaxing to maintain combustion. The heat output from your improvised fuel proves disappointingly brief and weak compared to the coal or proper firewood you had previously burned. The wooden handles and small furniture pieces consumed themselves with alarming speed, while producing barely enough warmth to be felt beyond arm's length from the stove. The mathematical reality becomes unavoidable. You are burning through resources faster than they can provide meaningful heat. Your husband manages to break apart one of the interior doors from the pantry, the destruction requiring enormous effort that leaves him gasping and trembling from exertion. The door panels provide more substantial fuel than your previous efforts, though the work of preparing them for burning consumes precious energy and exposes both of you to additional cold while the stove sits temporarily unfed. The doorwood burns more successfully than your smaller improvised fuel, producing flames substantial enough to create a small zone of relative warmth around the stove. Yet even this improved heating proves inadequate to restore the comfortable temperatures you had briefly enjoyed during your coal-fueled reprieve. The cold maintains its relentless pressure, requiring constant fuel input to achieve even minimal heat output. Your clothing has become a complex system of layers that must be constantly adjusted to balance insulation needs against the requirement for mobility in your fuel-gathering efforts. Each garment carries ice crystals from your breath and perspiration, creating a damp barrier that conducts heat away from your body while restricting the movement necessary for survival tasks. The decision to burn additional clothing becomes more urgent as your wooden fuel supply approaches exhaustion once again. The garments closest to your skin have absorbed moisture that would make them burn poorly, while outer layers provide insulation you can ill afford to sacrifice. The choice between immediate heat and continued protection represents another impossible decision in your growing collection of survival paradoxes. Your undergarments burn quickly when fed to the flames, producing brief flares of intense heat that feel almost violent in their sudden warmth before consuming themselves entirely. The cotton and linen transform into energy and ash with mechanical efficiency, providing moments of comfort that vanish as quickly as they appear, while permanently reducing your insulation capacity. The psychological weight of burning your clothes carries significance beyond their practical value, marking another step in the systematic elimination of everything that once defined your material existence. Each garment holds memories of social occasions, daily routines, and normal life activities that seem impossibly distant from your current circumstances. You are literally watching your former identity disappear into flames that provide barely adequate compensation. Your husband removes his remaining outer shirt, adding it to the fire with the resigned determination of someone who understands that all possessions have become negotiable in the mathematics of survival. The shirt burns more slowly than your undergarments, providing sustained heat that allows both of you to warm your hands directly over the flames for precious minutes before the fuel is consumed. The house continues its systematic surrender to forces beyond its design capacity, new sounds echoing through the structure as timber contracts past normal limits and joints separate under impossible stress. Somewhere in the walls, pipes burst with sounds like gunshots, adding water damage to the growing list of destruction that accompanies this unprecedented weather event. Your neighborhood has fallen into complete silence, broken only by the occasional crash of something collapsing under accumulated snow and ice. No voices call from neighboring houses, no footsteps crunch through the frozen streets, no signs of human activity penetrate the white wasteland that Manchester has become. The absence of familiar sounds creates an isolation so complete it feels like being the last people alive on Earth. The food in your pantry requires heating to become digestible, creating direct competition between nutrition needs and heating requirements that both draw from your dwindling fuel supply. Every meal becomes an exercise in resource allocation that sacrifices warmth for sustenance or accepts hunger to preserve heating capability. The calculations grow more desperate as both needs become increasingly urgent. Your remaining vegetables have frozen to the consistency of stones, requiring significant thawing before they can be prepared for consumption. The energy cost of rendering them edible may exceed their nutritional value, yet your body's demand for fuel to generate internal heat makes eating essential, despite the inefficiency of the process. The preserved meat provides better nutritional density, but requires careful warming to prevent digestive shock from consuming food at near-freezing temperatures. The process demands fuel allocation that directly reduces your heating capacity, while addressing hunger that weakens your ability to perform the physical tasks necessary for continued survival. Your water supply represents the most critical resource management challenge, requiring constant attention to prevent refreezing while providing the hydration essential for basic bodily functions. The containers must be rotated near your inadequate heat source to maintain liquid state, a process that competes directly with your need to warm food and maintain minimal air temperature. The evening approaches with mechanical inevitability, bringing the promise of temperatures that will drop even further below the already impossible levels you have been enduring. Night means longer hours of darkness during which your inadequate heating system must sustain life without the psychological comfort provided by even weak daylight filtering through frost-covered windows. Your husband's condition stabilizes at a level that suggests survival through the next few hours is possible, though his breathing remains labored and his color continues to show the grayish pallor of someone whose cardiovascular system is operating under extreme duress. The improvement during your heated periods demonstrates that recovery remains theoretically possible, but only if adequate warmth can be maintained for extended periods. The mathematical certainty of fuel exhaustion hangs over every moment like a countdown timer, marking the approach of an inevitable conclusion. Every piece of wood burned, every garment sacrificed, every book page consumed, brings you measurably closer to the point where no combustible materials remain, and the cold will claim final victory over your desperate resistance. Yet something persists beyond mere biological survival instincts, some quality of human spirit that refuses to be reduced to simple resource management and thermodynamic calculations. Your husband reaches for your hand with fingers that tremble from cold and exhaustion, but still communicate tenderness along with determination. The gesture acknowledges both the gravity of your situation and the profound meaning found in facing whatever comes together. The conversation between you requires few words, communicating through shared understanding what language cannot adequately express about love that transcends circumstances and dignity that survives when everything else has been systematically stripped away by forces beyond human control. You have discovered resources within yourselves that emerge only when every external comfort has been eliminated, and raw existence becomes the only remaining concern. The fire burns lower with each passing minute, consuming your improvised fuel with the same mechanical efficiency that has characterized every stage of this ordeal. Each flame represents seconds of life ticking away toward an outcome that rational calculation suggests will arrive within hours rather than days. Yet rational calculation has proven inadequate to capture the full complexity of human response to impossible circumstances. Your small kitchen has become the entire universe, its boundaries defining the limits of warmth, safety, and hope in a world that has contracted to the size of heat radiation from a dying fire. Beyond those boundaries lies a frozen wasteland that was once familiar neighborhood streets, now transformed into something alien and hostile to human existence. The snow continues falling outside your frost-covered windows, each flake adding infinitesimal weight to accumulations that have already buried the lower floors of buildings and eliminated every landmark that once made navigation possible. The storm shows no signs of weakening or moving through the region, suggesting that conditions will continue worsening rather than improving in the hours ahead. Your breathing has become labored not from exertion, but from the simple effort of processing air so cold it seems to freeze in your lungs before oxygen can enter your bloodstream. Each breath requires conscious attention and effort, transforming the most basic biological function into an active challenge that demands energy you can barely spare. The cold presses against your small zone of warmth with relentless persistence, probing for weaknesses in your defenses and gradually infiltrating despite every effort to maintain barriers against its advance. You can feel it creeping up through the floorboards, radiating from the walls, descending from the ceiling like an invisible tide that rises steadily toward the point where resistance becomes impossible. Your husband speaks quietly about practical matters, discussing the location of documents and possessions that might be important should anyone survive to deal with such concerns. His voice carries no despair or self-pity, only the calm efficiency of someone completing necessary tasks while time remains available. The conversation feels surreal given your circumstances, yet provides a framework for maintaining dignity and purpose when physical survival has become increasingly unlikely. The process of systematic destruction continues as you prepare the last combustible items within reach for feeding to flames that demand constant nourishment. Wooden picture frames, the handles of kitchen implements, even the thin wooden backing of your small mirror become candidates for conversion into brief moments of heat that may extend your existence by precious additional minutes. Each item sacrificed carries memories and associations that once provided psychological comfort and social identity, now reduced to simple calculations of burning time versus preparation effort. The transformation feels complete and irreversible, as if the cold has rewritten the fundamental purpose and meaning of every object in your domestic environment. Your hands have lost so much sensation that determining the texture and temperature of objects requires visual confirmation rather than tactile feedback. The progression of numbness creeps steadily up your arms despite every effort to maintain circulation through movement and proximity to your inadequate heat source. The loss of fine motor control makes every task increasingly difficult and dangerous. The fire burns with desperate hunger as you feed it whatever materials you can prepare for consumption, yet the heat output continues to diminish as fuel quality decreases and your ability to maintain proper combustion deteriorates with exhaustion and cold. The flames seem to mock your efforts, consuming everything you can provide while offering barely adequate compensation in return. Your kitchen window reveals a world that has moved beyond winter into something altogether more alien and hostile. The familiar geometry of streets and buildings has been erased by snow accumulations that create smooth, undulating surfaces bearing no resemblance to human habitation. The transformation feels permanent rather than temporary, as if this frozen wasteland represents a new reality that will persist long after any individual survival concerns have been resolved. The silence outside has become so complete that your own heartbeat sounds unnaturally loud in your ears, each pulse echoing through your consciousness like a drum marking time toward an inevitable conclusion. Yet within that silence, something else emerges, a quality of attention and presence that belongs only to moments when every non-essential concern has been stripped away by circumstances that demand complete focus on immediate existence. Your husband's eyes hold a clarity that speaks of acceptance without surrender, of love that requires no future to justify its present reality, of dignity that persists even when hope has been mathematically eliminated. The expression communicates more than words could convey about what matters when everything else has been taken away by forces beyond human authority or influence. The fire burns lower, the shadows deepen, and night approaches with its promise of temperatures that will test every assumption about the limits of human endurance. Yet something essential has been preserved in these hours of desperate struggle, something that no amount of cold can touch or destroy completely. The last pieces of improvised fuel feed the dying flames as evening settles over a Manchester that has become unrecognizable beneath its burden of snow and ice. Whatever comes next, you will face it together, with whatever strength and grace remain available to ordinary people, confronting circumstances that exceed every reasonable expectation of what human beings should be required to endure. The fire burns lower still, but something else burns brighter in the warmth it has briefly provided, a flame that requires no external fuel and produces a heat that transcends mere temperature. The longest night of your lives approaches with mechanical inevitability, carrying challenges that will demand every resource you have discovered within yourselves, and perhaps some you have yet to find. The coals settle into their final arrangement with whispers that sound like prayers, each spark a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, light continues to exist for those who have learned to see it in places where logic suggests none should remain. The embers fade to black ash, their final glow extinguished like hopes that once seemed reasonable. The darkness that follows is not merely absence of light, but presence of something far more sinister. Cold rushes into your kitchen with the enthusiasm of a predator, finally claiming its territory, transforming the air itself into something that burns your throat and sears your lungs with every desperate breath. Your husband's hand in yours grows slack, though whether from unconsciousness or something worse, you cannot determine in the absolute blackness that has swallowed your world. His breathing, when you press your ear close to his mouth, comes in shallow gasps that create barely perceptible wisps of warmth against your frozen cheek. The sound terrifies you more than complete silence would, suggesting a body fighting battles it cannot possibly win. The temperature plummets with such velocity that you can actually feel it happening, a physical sensation like being pressed deeper and deeper into icy water. Your clothing, already inadequate, becomes a cruel joke as the fabric stiffens into an armor that restricts movement while providing no protection whatsoever against the advancing cold that seems to have weight and intention. Moving requires planning now. Each shift of position must be calculated to minimize heat loss while accomplishing whatever task demands attention. The simple act of reaching for the water container becomes an expedition fraught with risk. Your arm exposed to air so hostile that skin begins numbing within seconds of leaving the inadequate shelter of blankets. The water has begun its inevitable transformation back to ice, thin crystals forming around the edges, despite every precaution you had taken to preserve it in liquid form. The sight represents more than inconvenience. It marks the moment when your last defense against dehydration joins the growing list of resources claimed by winter's relentless advance. Your throat burns with thirst, yet consuming the partially frozen water sends shockwaves through your system that seem to drain more energy than the hydration provides. Each swallow becomes a conscious decision, weighing immediate need against the systemic cost of introducing near-freezing liquid into a body already struggling to maintain core temperature. The house around you continues its surrender with sounds that have evolved from occasional creaks to constant groaning, as if the very structure is in pain. Timber contracts beyond its design limits, while joints separate under stress no architect had imagined possible. The building that once provided security now feels like a wounded animal, struggling to maintain its basic function while forces beyond its capacity systematically destroy its ability to shelter human life. Your breathing creates the only sound in a world that has fallen into supernatural quiet. Even the wind has died to barely a whisper, leaving you trapped in silence so complete it makes your heartbeat seem thunderous. The absence of familiar sounds, the normal background noise of urban life that usually provides unconscious comfort, has been replaced by a void that amplifies every small noise until it assumes ominous significance. Somewhere in the distance, something collapses with a crash that reverberates through the frozen air before being swallowed by the snow-muffled landscape. Whether building, tree, or some other structure succumbing to impossible loads of accumulated ice, you cannot determine. The sound serves only to remind you that destruction continues throughout your neighborhood while you remain trapped in your own desperate struggle. Your husband stirs beside you, his movement so slight you might have imagined it, if not for the small shift in weight against your side. When you whisper his name, the response comes as a mumble that carries no coherent words, only the sound of a mind retreating to places where cold cannot follow. The confusion frightens you more than his physical symptoms, suggesting damage that extends beyond simple hypothermia into realms where recovery becomes theoretical rather than practical. The darkness has weight and presence, pressing down upon you like a living thing that feeds on warmth and hope. Your eyes, straining to perceive any detail in the absolute blackness, begin creating their own images. Shadows move independently of any light source. Shapes shift and reform in patterns that suggest meaning while conveying only the growing instability of a mind pushed beyond its normal operating parameters. Time becomes elastic and unreliable in this frozen void. Minutes stretch into apparent hours, while longer periods disappear entirely from memory, leaving gaps in consciousness that may represent microsleeps or something more concerning. The weak daylight that once provided psychological anchor points has vanished, replaced by uniform darkness that offers no clues about the passage of time or the approach of morning. Your body has begun the process of systematic shutdown, redirecting blood flow away from extremities that have already lost most sensation toward organs essential for immediate survival. The progression follows predictable patterns documented in medical texts you had never imagined would apply to your own experience. Fingers and toes disappear first, becoming foreign objects attached to your body without meaningful connection to your conscious control. The numbness creeps steadily inward, claiming territory with methodical persistence that suggests your body has already made calculations about which parts can be sacrificed to preserve core functions. Arms and legs become increasingly difficult to move, not from external cold alone, but from internal decisions made by biological systems operating according to priorities that transcend individual preferences. Your face has lost most sensation. lips and cheeks becoming mask-like barriers between your consciousness and the world beyond. Speaking requires enormous effort to coordinate muscles that no longer respond with their normal precision, while hearing seems muffled as if your ears have been packed with cotton that grows thicker with each passing hour. The preserved meat in your pantry represents calories your body desperately needs, yet consuming food at temperatures approaching freezing creates digestive challenges that may consume more energy than the nutrition provides. The cruel mathematics of survival demand calculations that have no satisfying answers, only choices between different forms of deterioration. Your husband's condition continues its steady decline, despite every effort to share what little warmth your bodies can generate through proximity. His breathing has become irregular, long pauses, followed by sudden gasping intakes that suggest his respiratory system is struggling with the basic task of processing air too cold for human physiology to handle effectively. The water containers have completed their transformation to solid ice, creating barriers between you and hydration that would require heat you no longer possess to overcome. The site marks another milestone in your systematic isolation from the resources necessary to sustain human life for any extended period. Dehydration begins its own assault on your already compromised systems, creating additional stress that compounds the effects of cold exposure and inadequate nutrition. Your mouth feels lined with cotton, while thoughts become increasingly difficult to form and maintain with the clarity necessary for complex decision-making about resource allocation and survival strategy. The psychological weight of isolation presses down with increasing intensity as hours pass, without any indication that rescue or relief might arrive from external sources. The knowledge that no help is coming, that survival depends entirely on resources already proven inadequate, creates a despair that must be actively resisted to prevent complete surrender to circumstances that offer no reasonable hope. Your small kitchen has contracted to the size of the area within arm's reach of where you lie. Everything beyond that boundary belonging to a hostile world where human life cannot be sustained. The familiar objects of domestic life, visible now only in memory, have been transformed into alien artifacts from a civilization that once existed but seems as distant as ancient history. The floorboards beneath your makeshift bed radiate cold with such intensity that they seem to actively draw heat from your body, rather than simply lacking warmth. The sensation suggests that the very structure of your home has become an enemy, aligned with the winter forces that seek to eliminate any trace of human warmth or comfort from this frozen landscape. Your clothing has become a complex system of frozen barriers that restrict movement, while failing to provide meaningful insulation against temperatures that exceed the design parameters of any fabric intended for human comfort. Each layer carries accumulated ice from your breath and perspiration, creating damp surfaces that conduct heat away from your skin with mechanical efficiency. The decision about whether to attempt sleep becomes another impossible calculation, weighing the body's need for rest against the very real possibility that unconsciousness might prove permanent under these conditions. Sleep requires metabolic changes that could prove fatal when core temperature has already dropped to levels that challenge basic cellular function. Your husband's hand has grown cold in yours, despite every effort to maintain circulation through gentle massage and shared body heat. The skin feels waxy and unnatural, suggesting changes that extend beyond simple surface cooling into realms where tissue damage may be occurring at the cellular level. The transformation terrifies you more than your own symptoms because it provides visible evidence of processes that cannot be reversed through willpower alone. The night stretches ahead like a frozen eternity, each minute requiring the same desperate calculations about energy conservation and resource allocation. Every breath consumes calories. Every movement burns fuel your body cannot spare. Every moment of consciousness demands attention that grows more difficult to maintain as hypothermia affects cognitive function. Yet something persists beyond biological imperatives and mathematical certainties. Call it stubborn human spirit, Call it love that transcends physical circumstances. Call it the irreducible core of consciousness that refuses to be eliminated by mere temperature and resource scarcity. Whatever name applies, this quality burns without fuel and radiates warmth that no thermometer could measure. Your husband mumbles words that carry no meaning in conventional language, but communicate something essential about shared experience and mutual support that requires no translation. The sounds emerge from a mind retreating toward places where cold cannot follow, yet they carry emotional content that speaks of connections deeper than conscious thought. The darkness presses closer with each passing hour, yet it cannot touch certain forms of light that emerge only when everything else has been stripped away by circumstances that demand complete focus on immediate existence. You have discovered resources within yourself that emerge only when external comfort has been systematically eliminated, and raw survival becomes the only remaining concern. The cold advances with methodical persistence, claiming territory inch by inch as your body's defenses fail, and surrender becomes increasingly inevitable. Yet surrender itself takes on new meaning when faced with dignity and grace that persist even when hope has been mathematically eliminated by forces beyond human authority or control. The longest night continues its relentless progression toward a dawn that may never arrive for two people who have found something precious in the systematic destruction of everything they once believed necessary for happiness or meaning. The fire may have died, the fuel may be exhausted, but something else burns brighter in the darkness that surrounds your small sanctuary against the infinite cold. Your breathing grows shallower with each hour, yet consciousness persists with stubborn determination to witness whatever comes next. The mathematics of survival point toward inevitable conclusions, but mathematics alone cannot capture the full complexity of human response to circumstances that exceed every reasonable expectation of what people should be required to endure. The house groans around you like a living thing in its final moments, yet it continues to provide some barrier between your fragile human bodies and the full fury of winter's assault. Even in failure, even as systems collapse and defenses prove inadequate, your home maintains its essential function of creating space where human dignity can persist for whatever time remains available. The snow continues falling outside windows you can no longer see through, each flake adding weight to accumulations that have transformed Manchester into something unrecognizable. Yet each flake is also part of the water cycle that makes all life possible, part of natural systems that generally support, rather than threaten, human existence across the vast scales of geological time. Your husband's breathing becomes your anchor to the present moment, each intake and exhalation marking time in a world where clocks have stopped and normal measures of duration have lost their meaning. The sound connects you to life itself, to the fundamental biological processes that continue despite circumstances that seem designed to eliminate any possibility of survival. The cold presses against your small zone of shared warmth with relentless determination, yet it cannot touch certain forms of heat that exist independent of temperature and fuel consumption. Love burns without oxygen, dignity radiates without combustion. Human spirit glows without any external energy source beyond the mysterious fact of consciousness itself. Morning may never come, rescue may prove impossible, survival may exceed the capacity of human physiology to achieve under these conditions. Yet something essential has been preserved in these hours of desperate struggle, something that transcends individual existence and connects to larger patterns of meaning that persist even when particular lives reach their natural conclusions. The fire died hours ago, but other flames burn brighter in the darkness that surrounds your final sanctuary, against forces that recognize no human authority. Whatever comes next, you face it together, with whatever strength and grace remain available to ordinary people who have discovered extraordinary resources within themselves when everything else has been taken away. The night continues its progression toward whatever dawn may be possible, carrying challenges that will test every assumption about what human beings can endure and what makes existence meaningful when reduced to its most essential elements. The cold may claim your bodies, but it cannot touch what you have found together in the systematic elimination of everything once believed necessary for happiness or hope. The longest hours stretch ahead with mechanical inevitability, yet they carry possibilities that no amount of rational calculation can eliminate entirely. In the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the silence between thoughts, something persists that no winter can completely extinguish. Your consciousness flickers like a candle in a hurricane, moments of clarity alternating with periods where thought itself seems to freeze before forming. The boundary between waking and sleeping has dissolved entirely, replaced by a twilight state where dreams and reality merge into something neither fully one nor the other. Your husband's breathing beside you provides the only rhythm in a world where time has lost all conventional meaning. The house has begun talking in its own language of destruction. Walls contract with sounds like distant gunshots, while somewhere deep in the structure, water pipes surrender with sharp reports that echo through rooms you can no longer reach. Each noise carries the weight of finality, marking another system's failure in your home's systematic capitulation to forces it was never designed to resist. Your body temperature has dropped beyond the point where shivering provides any meaningful heat generation. The violent tremors that characterized earlier stages of hypothermia have given way to an ominous stillness that speaks of biological systems making their final calculations about energy allocation. Your muscles have relaxed into positions that require no conscious maintenance, as if your body has decided to conserve every possible calorie for functions more essential than movement. The sensation of cold has evolved beyond mere temperature into something that feels like being slowly dissolved from the outside inward. Your skin has become a barrier that exists more in memory than present sensation, while deeper tissues report their distress through pains that shift and migrate, as circulation continues its strategic retreat toward your core organs. Your thoughts arrive with increasing irregularity, each one requiring enormous effort to form and maintain long enough for comprehension. Simple concepts that once required no conscious attention now demand careful assembly from components that resist organization. The mental fog thickens with each passing hour, creating gaps in awareness that may last minutes or hours without your knowledge of their duration. Your husband's condition has stabilized at a level that suggests his body has found some temporary equilibrium between energy conservation and basic function maintenance. His breathing, while shallow and irregular, continues with mechanical persistence that offers hope even as his responses to your voice become increasingly delayed and disconnected from conventional meaning. The water containers have achieved complete transformation into solid ice, creating sculptures that mock your earlier attempts at preparation and resource management. The site represents more than inconvenience or even crisis. It marks the moment when your last renewable resource joins the growing catalogue of materials claimed by winter's methodical advance through your defenses. Your throat burns with thirst that has moved beyond discomfort into genuine physiological distress, yet no solutions remain within reach that would not require energy expenditure exceeding any possible benefit. The cruel mathematics of survival have eliminated options with ruthless efficiency, leaving only the choice between different forms of deterioration, rather than any path toward actual improvement. The silence outside has achieved a quality that seems almost supernatural in its completeness. No wind stirs the accumulated snow. No sounds of human activity penetrate the white barrier that has buried your neighborhood beneath depths that eliminate every familiar landmark. The absence of normal urban sounds creates an isolation so profound it makes your own heartbeat seem unnaturally loud and significant. Your kitchen has contracted to the size of the small area where warmth from your bodies creates a temperature differential, measurable in single degrees, rather than the tens of degrees that once seemed barely adequate. Beyond this tiny zone of relative comfort lies a hostile environment where human survival becomes theoretically impossible within minutes of exposure. The familiar objects of domestic life have transformed into alien artifacts from a civilization that seems impossibly distant despite existing mere days ago. The cast iron stove that once represented security and comfort now looms like a monument to your failure to maintain the systems necessary for basic human survival. Its cold metal surface radiates hostility with the same intensity it once provided life-sustaining warmth. Your clothing has become a complex archaeological record of your struggle, each layer telling the story of decisions made under increasingly desperate circumstances. Ice crystals form elaborate patterns where your breath has frozen against fabric surfaces, creating beautiful formations that serve as visible proof of your body's ongoing attempts to maintain basic metabolic functions. The psychological challenge of maintaining any form of hope becomes as difficult as the physical demands of survival itself. Every rational calculation points toward inevitable conclusions that no amount of wishful thinking can alter. Yet some primitive part of consciousness continues searching for solutions that logic knows cannot exist within your current parameters of possibility. Your husband speaks occasionally in fragments that carry emotional weight despite their lack of conventional meaning. The words emerge from increasingly deep levels of consciousness, where language serves different purposes than communication of practical information. The sounds comfort you more than their content, representing proof that essential humanity persists, even as cognitive function deteriorates under impossible stress. The progression of hypothermia follows patterns documented in medical literature you had never imagined would apply to your own experience. Each stage arrives with predictable symptoms that mark your body's systematic preparation for shutdown. Biological processes following ancient protocols designed to preserve life for as long as physically possible under conditions that exceed normal survival parameters. Your extremities have progressed beyond numbness into complete sensory absence, becoming foreign objects attached to your body without meaningful connection to conscious control. The progression follows predictable patterns as circulation retreats toward organs essential for immediate survival, abandoning territory that can be sacrificed to maintain core functions for additional precious hours. The darkness has weight and presence that presses against your consciousness with increasing intensity as hours pass without any external stimulation to anchor your awareness to conventional reality. Visual hallucinations begin at the periphery of vision, shadows that move independently and shapes that suggest meaning while providing only evidence of a mind operating beyond its normal parameters. Time becomes elastic and unreliable in this sensory void, where normal anchors for measuring duration have disappeared entirely. Minutes stretch into subjective hours, while longer periods vanish from memory without leaving traces of their passage. The weak daylight that once provided psychological comfort has been replaced by uniform darkness that offers no clues about temporal progression or the possibility of eventual dawn. Your breathing creates the only reliable rhythm in a world where heartbeat has become irregular and thoughts arrive without predictable sequence. Each inhalation requires conscious effort as your respiratory system struggles to process air so cold it seems to crystallize before reaching your bloodstream. The simple act of maintaining basic life functions demands attention that once occurred automatically below the threshold of awareness. The house continues its systematic surrender with sounds that have evolved from occasional protests to constant adjustment as materials contract beyond their design specifications. Joints separate under stress no architect had anticipated, while structural elements shift in ways that suggest permanent damage, accumulating faster than any repair process could address even under normal circumstances. Your husband's hand in yours has grown cold despite every effort to maintain circulation through gentle massage and shared body heat. The skin feels different in ways that suggest changes occurring at cellular levels, where damage may be accumulating beyond the reach of simple warming techniques. The transformation frightens you more than your own symptoms because it provides tangible evidence of processes that cannot be reversed through determination alone. The food in your pantry represents calories your body desperately needs, yet accessing and consuming nutrition at these temperatures creates challenges that may consume more energy than the sustenance provides. The mathematics of survival offer no satisfying solutions, only choices between different forms of resource depletion, that all lead toward the same inevitable conclusions. Your mouth has become lined with what feels like cotton. Saliva production reduced to levels that make swallowing difficult, even when liquid remains available. Dehydration compounds the effects of hypothermia and malnutrition, creating cascading failures in biological systems that depend on adequate hydration for basic cellular function. The progression follows predictable patterns that accelerate as multiple stressors interact in ways that exceed your body's capacity for adaptation. The floorboards beneath your makeshift bed conduct cold with such efficiency that they seem to actively draw heat from your body rather than simply lacking warmth themselves. The sensation suggests that every surface in your home has become aligned with winter forces that seek to eliminate any trace of human comfort or survival from this frozen landscape that was once a neighborhood where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Your consciousness flickers between present awareness and places where cold cannot follow, internal landscapes where warmth exists, independent of external temperature and fuel consumption. These mental refuges become increasingly attractive as physical circumstances deteriorate beyond any reasonable hope of improvement through available resources or human effort alone. The night progresses with mechanical inevitability toward whatever dawn may be possible under conditions that have moved beyond normal weather into realms where human survival becomes theoretical rather than practical. Each hour demands the same desperate calculations about energy conservation and resource allocation, while offering no new solutions to problems that have already eliminated most available options. Your husband's breathing provides anchor to immediate reality, even as his responses to external stimuli become increasingly disconnected from conventional patterns of communication and awareness. The sounds he makes carry emotional content that transcends language, representing something essential about shared experience that requires no translation or conscious interpretation to communicate its fundamental meaning. The cold presses against your small zone of shared warmth with relentless determination, yet it cannot touch certain forms of heat that exist independent of measurable temperature. Love radiates without fuel consumption. Dignity glows without combustion. Human spirit burns with flames that require no oxygen or combustible materials to maintain their essential brightness in darkness that has weight and presence. Your body has begun processes that prepare for conclusions your mind refuses to accept. Biological systems following protocols that prioritize species survival over individual continuation when resources become inadequate to maintain both possibilities simultaneously. The progression follows patterns older than consciousness itself, ancient wisdom encoded in cellular memory that operates according to priorities that transcend personal preferences about outcomes. The house groans around you like a wounded animal in its final moments, yet it continues providing some barrier between your fragile human bodies and the full fury of atmospheric conditions that exceed every reasonable expectation of what domestic architecture should be required to withstand. Even in systematic failure, your home maintains its essential function of creating space where human dignity can persist for whatever time remains available under impossible circumstances. The silence has achieved qualities that seem to exist beyond mere absence of sound, creating presence that fills available space with attention so complete it makes your heartbeat seem thunderous in comparison. The void, where familiar urban sounds once provided unconscious comfort, has been replaced by something that amplifies every small noise until it assumes significance that extends far beyond its practical importance for survival planning. Your thoughts arrive with decreasing frequency and increasing difficulty, each one requiring assembly from components that resist organization into coherent patterns. The mental fog thickens with each passing hour, while gaps in awareness may represent micro-sleeps or something more concerning about cognitive function under stress that exceeds normal human experience by orders of magnitude that eliminate meaningful comparison to previous challenges. The water cycle continues outside your frost-covered windows, snow falling with mechanical persistence that adds weight to accumulations already sufficient to eliminate every landmark that once made navigation possible in familiar neighborhood streets. Each flake represents part of atmospheric systems that generally support rather than threaten human existence across geological timescales that dwarf individual experience or immediate survival concerns. Your breathing becomes increasingly labored as your respiratory system struggles with basic tasks that once required no conscious attention or energy allocation. The simple act of processing air too cold for human physiology demands resources your body can barely spare while providing oxygen absorption that decreases as core temperature drops beyond optimal ranges for cellular function and metabolic efficiency. The darkness presses closer with each passing moment, yet it cannot eliminate certain forms of light that emerge only when everything else has been stripped away by circumstances that demand complete focus on immediate existence rather than future planning or past regret. You have discovered resources within yourself that surface only when external comfort has been systematically removed and survival becomes the sole remaining priority for conscious attention. And so the longest night draws toward whatever dawn may come. Margaret and her husband face the final hours with a dignity that transcends their desperate circumstances, having discovered that love burns brightest when everything else has been stripped away. Their story reminds us that human resilience isn't measured by comfort or convenience, but by grace under impossible pressure. The next time you adjust your thermostat or complain about the cold, remember these two souls who found warmth in each other when winter claimed everything else.